So Juan Gonzalez Giron is finishing up his PhD in the lab of Dr. Chris Smart. Chris and Juan are in the plant pathology and plant microbiology section of the School of Integrative Plant Science at Cornell University. Juan has been working on bacterial spot diseases of tomato and pepper, and he's going to be chatting with us today about recognizing some common tomato diseases in your home garden, which I know is a concern for me, and I hope you all learned something. So thank you, Juan. Go right ahead.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us today. Please remember that you can type any questions that you get in the chat, and I will try my best to answer them at the end of the presentation. So as Dr. Dunn mentioned, I'm Juan Gonzalez Giron. I'm a PhD candidate in plant pathology at Cornell University. And in the SMART laboratory, my research focuses on understanding a bacterial disease that infects tomato and pepper and can be quite devastating. Throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about how to use the appropriate set of observation skills and perhaps a little bit of motivation to expand our understanding into what's bugging you regarding tomatoes. So tomatoes are a major crop that's evident for everyone, and they are planted commercially here in the United States as well as around the world. Here in the country, production goes up to 2.7 billion pounds that goes mostly for fresh market, making tomato one of the most widely consumed vegetables locally. Beyond the commercial cultivation of tomatoes, tomatoes have been historically a great addition to home gardens. They have been widely planted by home horticulturalists. So that poses the challenge, how to grow healthy tomatoes at home, given the lack of resources at a large scale. So here in this slide, you can see an illustration of the 4 different variables that affect the behavior of a disease in our garden tomatoes. Basically, plant health is determined by the interaction between the environment, the plant itself, a pathogen or a potential pest, and how do all of the symptoms progress over time. Here in this presentation, we'll get a glimpse into what guidelines can you use to make appropriate observations in the case that our garden tomatoes are not looking proper or are not looking well. So before delving into what kind of diseases our tomatoes can get, it is important to identify that symptoms are basically a reaction of the plant to a disease infection. So in this image here in this slide, you can see that some of the plants are showing yellowing of some of the leaves. That's known as chlorosis, and it is one of the main common symptoms of some diseases of our garden tomatoes. There are many other symptoms that plants can show. For instance, here in this photo, you can see wilting of some tomato plants. In this case, the cause of that wilting is probably underground, and it is not due to the simple lack of irrigation. In this photograph over here, you can see the presence of spots in leaves of tomato, and analyzing very, very detailed the shape and the progression of spots over time will definitely allow us to get a proper identification of what's happening to our tomatoes. A sign of a disease is a direct evidence of the presence of the pathogen. For example, we have that certain fungal infections by fungi, often appear cottony fibers that are emerging from the tissue. However, in the case of infections with bacteria, it is often that we see a sticky exudate coming from within the plant tissue. So it is also very important that we take note of the progression of symptoms over time. In this case, it is important because symptoms and signs that are caused by a disease often progress over time, in contrast to abiotic damage, like damage that we can see, for instance, with hail, that does not progress over time. This will allow us to identify if what's happening to our tomatoes is caused by something that's alive or by something that depends on environmental conditions where our tomatoes are located. So now, with this in mind, you can use a defined set of steps to observe your tomatoes and take very detailed notes. So for instance, first, you should examine all the organs of the plant and ask some very basic questions. For instance, are leaf symptoms also present in the stem? Are spots that you can see on leaves also present on fruit or flowers? Can you observe any wilting across the entire plant? Or is it just that some branches or some leaves of your tomatoes are showing this symptom? This is also particularly important because some infections with fungi affect only one side of the plant. Second, again, it is very important to have a record of the shape and the extent of symptoms and try to infer some trends. Are all of the leaves affected, or is it just the younger leaves? This is particularly important because in some diseases, the younger tissues tend to be more susceptible, but in different diseases, it is often the older leaves that are closer to the soil, the ones that show the first symptoms. Also, it is particularly important to take notes and detailed photographic evidence of what you see that's happening to your tomatoes. Third, have thorough observations for signs of a pathogen. Do you see any exudates that might indicate an infection with a bacteria? Are there signs of any fungal infection like mycelia or dark clumps of tissue emerging from the plant? Basically, do you observe insects roaming around the plant? Fourth, be attentive to your garden surroundings as well. Is it just one of your plants that's showing symptoms, or can you observe similar signs and symptoms in plants around your diseased tomato plant? This is also particularly important because diseases caused by living causal agents often infect multiple plants at a time. With that said, there are plenty of resources that you can use to guide yourself through the identification of your tomato disease. One of such resources is the Cornell Vegetables website that offers public fact sheets that you can use to compare against your own notes. Now, I'll show you some examples of diseases that might be affecting your garden tomatoes, but first we'll do that through a case scenario. So let's assume that in your home garden, you have 8-week-old tomato plants. And you can see that several individuals are showing some kind of disease. So first, identifying the symptoms. We can see in the image here of our case scenario that the leaf margin seems dry and brown. There seems to be some wilting despite that in the past 2 weeks, there was heavy rain. And some of the unripe fruits, as well as some slightly ripe fruits, show white sunken spots with a raised center. After taking detailed note of the symptoms, we'll then look for signs of a disease. In this photo over here, we don't see any observable fungal signs. However, we could notice that in a humid day previously, some leaves oozed a yellowish substance, which might lead us to believe that it is a bacterial infection. We also noted that symptoms have been getting worse since last week. So with all of this, I'll go through several potential bacterial diseases that will allow us to actually infer if our symptoms and signs correspond to already described diseases of tomato. The first bacterial disease that your tomatoes could be suffering from is bacterial speck. This disease is characterized by the induction of small spots on leaves and fruits that are surrounded by a yellow halo, as you can see in the photograph, and infected tissue might fall off. The disease is spread via contaminated seeds and rain splashes as well. The second disease would be bacterial spot caused by a different species of bacteria. This disease causes large spots on leaves and fruits, and it is very characteristically associated with hot and dry, and humid rainy conditions. This disease is also seed-borne. The third bacterial disease that your tomatoes could be suffering from is caused by Clavibacter michiganensis. It's bacterial canker. Bacterial canker is characterized by marginal necrosis of leaves, as you can see in the photo over there. It is also characterized by wilting due to a blockage of the vascular elements of the plants, and we can see bird's eye lesions on fruits. So with this, we could hypothesize that our tomatoes are suffering from bacterial canker. There are many other diseases that can be affecting your tomatoes, though. For instance, we have fungal and fungal-like diseases, and we'll see some examples of those. Septorial leaf spot is caused by the fungus Septoria lycopersicide. It is characterized by the induction of small spots with certain black dots and a yellow halo in stem and leaves, but very rarely happens on fruit. Diseases often happen after the first fruit sets, and the first symptoms often appear in the lower leaves, and then the disease spreads upwards. We also have, for instance, early blight. Early blight is characterized by lesions in stems, leaves, and the fruit that show concentric rings. The infection is named early blight because infection occurs early in the season due to inoculum from previous years. We also have another fungal disease, which is anthracnose. This is caused by the fungus Coledotrichum coccoides. It often appears on ripe fruit and shows sunken circular spots of about 1 inch in diameter, often showing concentric circles with dotted black spots. For instance, beyond just fungi, we also have water molds that can infect our tomato plants. Phytophthora infestans induces lesions on leaves that appear water-soaked and enlarge rapidly. This is the case of the disease named late blight. The undersides of leaves show spores that might give the whole plant a dusty appearance, and in fruits, the lesions appear greasy and circular. I need to emphasize here that plant health starts with disease prevention. So if even before you see a disease in your tomatoes, you can choose resistant tomato variables if they are available and purchase certified disease-free seed. If you happen to identify a disease that is caused by a pathogen, given what we already mentioned through the presentation, you can take several precautions. For instance, you should remove diseased material to reduce the probability of infections in the same plant as well as surrounding plants. Try to remove infected plant debris from the ground, even if it doesn't look infected. But please do not add any diseased material to your composting pile because there is the likelihood that some of these pathogens might survive. You can also use mulch around your plants as a barrier from the soil. And finally, visit your local garden store or horticulture club for treatments and practices. The main take-home messages that we can get from this presentation are that the health of your tomato plants is highly influenced by the pathogen that might be infecting your tomatoes, the environment, and the time. Different diseases show different signs and different symptoms as well. We also know that data collection implies thorough observation, and the more detailed data that you have, the most likely you will be able to identify a potential causal agent. Finally, the proper identification of signs and symptoms can turn anyone into a plant pathologist. So we should all be glad about that. I am showing here again the website of the Cornell Vegetable Pathology. There are many resources that you can find in this website if you can take note of it. Just beyond the vegetable disease fact sheets, you can find IPM practices, you can find other resources for vegetable pathology, as well as manuals about how to properly farm. With all of that, I'm open to questions. Thank you very much.
Great, Juan. Thank you so much. That's great information. If anyone has questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. While folks are typing, I have a question to ask. If you were to pick like one top 2 diseases or disease and abiotic problems that get confused, that you could tell people like, don't get trapped by this, these easily confused symptoms or signs, what would that be?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Dunn. Yes, for instance, one of the most common symptoms that we can get in our garden tomatoes is blossom end rot. Blossom end rot starts with the darkening of the below side of tomato fruits, and basically people confuse that with certain fungal infections like late blight, for example, but it is not caused by a pathogen itself. It is caused by a lack of calcium that happens because of either overwatering or underwatering of your garden tomatoes. So that's one, for instance. But also, without taking proper note of all of the signs and symptoms, it is very common to confuse different causal agents, even despite the fact that the causal agents might be remarkably different. So once you take detailed notes of what you're observing and take some time doing that, I'm sure that you won't have problems confusing diseases. Mm-hmm. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And there are a lot of great questions coming into the chat. I want to transition us to Abby's talk. And so I'm wondering if you might be willing to, if some of those questions can be answered in the chat, if you'd be willing to do that while Abby's talking to us about squash vine borer.
Yes, sure. I'll
Great,
do that.
thank you. Abby, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Unmute. Okay, I will do that.
So Abby Seaman is the vegetable IPM coordinator at New York State IPM. And among other things, she has a lot of expertise in insect pest management. She's my go-to person when I have insect pest questions on vegetables. And she's going to chat with us about tips for dealing with squash vine borer. And I suspect all of us who grow squash are eager to hear these tips. So go ahead, Abby.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
You sound good.
Okay, great. Yes, hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about squash vine borer, which is a pest that is active right now in the Geneva, New York area. And it probably started being active a little earlier, further south in the state or in the country. So this is the adult. It's really a very attractive clear-winged moth. You might see it hovering in front of flowers, feeding on nectar. But it is, despite its lovely appearance, it is a pest. And so wilting plants are the first sign that you might have a problem with squash vine borer. And I don't know if you've ever observed, sometimes all your squash will just kind of wilt in the afternoon. So when we're talking about squash vine borer, it would be individual plants wilting while others are not. So what these adult moths do is lay their eggs at the base of the stem. It's a small oval brown egg, a little bit hard to see. You have to get your nose right up into the plant to be able to see it. And then those eggs hatch and the larvae immediately bore into the stem of the plant. And one thing that I should have already mentioned is that squash vine borer is usually more of a problem on bush type of squash like zucchini, although they will also infest the vining squash. They're a little bit harder. They're more likely to kill the plant in a bush type of squash. So when they feed inside the stem, they push out their frass, which is the scientific name for insect poop. And if you cut open the stem, you can see this pretty robust, big white grub inside. So, and yeah, so when they're feeding in there, what they're doing is they're destroying the vascular tissue or the plumbing of the plant, and that's why the plants wilt. So we'll just launch right into some prevention, and please go ahead and put any questions in chat. And I'll talk about a few things that I know about to prevent them, but if you have other ideas, please, I'm going to ask you to share them at the end if we have other ideas that you're using or other methods. So one thing that you can do to prevent squash vine borer is to cover your squash with floating row cover during the period that the moths are laying eggs. And so you can use growing degree days to forecast when the moths will be laying eggs, and you want to use a base 50 growing degree day, and there's various places where you can get growing degree days. Some county extension offices will provide that on their website. But you can also use chicory flowers, which I'll show you in a minute. Chicory flowering, a very common roadside weed, flowers at about the same time we accumulate 1,000 base 50 degree days. But if you're going to use this row cover method, you want to remember to remove the row cover for a while every morning or a lot of mornings to allow for pollination if you have female flowers. And here's a picture I took of a big chicory plant in my yard this morning. It's a lovely blue flower and very common. So if you're not familiar with it, when you are driving around next time you're driving, you will see it by the side of the road, I predict. So if you are not successful with prevention, or you're not willing to go to all the trouble of putting on and off the row cover, we're going into destroy mode. The first thing you can think about destroying is the eggs. And like I said, they're small and you really have to get up close and personal with your squash, but I have done it a couple of years. And so all you would do is look for them at the base of your plants and squish them. The next thing you can think when you're in destroy mode is to destroy the larvae inside the stem. So the frass on the outside is a sign of where the larvae are feeding. And if you cut along the length of the stem right here and just slit the stem open and go in there with some kind of a sharp implement, you can kill them. You can also think about mounding soil around the stem where you did this, so new roots will form, and that's especially helpful when you're not dealing with a bush type of squash, but you're dealing with an infestation on part of a vining stem of squash. And so those are the ideas that I have. I'd be happy to answer any questions and hear any other ideas that other people have used or tried for managing squash vine borer. And I can't see the chat right now, so I'm going to stop sharing.
So one quick question so far. If you plant after July 4th, will that enable you to avoid squash vine borer?
That's a great question. And I told you when the squash vine borer adults start flying, but I didn't tell you how long they tend to fly. So they start flying around chicory flowering or at about 1,000 base 50 degree days, and they'll fly for another 3 weeks. So that would be a long time to wait. You could certainly plant summer squash after that period of time and still get some yield, but that would be too late for planting winter squash.
Okay. There are 1 or 2 more questions in the chat, Abby. If you have a moment to answer those, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I can send them to you by email and we can get those answers posted on YouTube when we get the recording up.
Okay, I will do that.
Thank you. And thank you for speaking today. Thank you both to Abby and to Juan for speaking. This was some really great information. And definitely I learned some things that I can be using in my garden as well. Just one more plug reminder, to use some of the things that you've learned today, some of these ideas. Go outside this weekend, snap some pictures of how you're doing IPM around your tomatoes and squash, and send them to us. You can find the link for this on our website where you register. And it is also in the chat a little bit earlier on. And I can post that as well in the chat, I think, one more time. Please make sure that you do register for upcoming What's Bugging You First Friday events. And you can watch the recording on YouTube.